Audiobooks. Non-print final assignment. Courtney Bullock. Introduction. Today I will be delivering an audiobook on audiobooks, though I use the initial claim audiobook loosely due to the delivery of my work. I am completing a final assignment for my print culture studies class on a digital culture that has been influenced by print culture. As stated in the assignment outline, in regards to orality and literacy, according to Walter Ong, once we begin to internalize the effects of a new technology, we may use those effects to critique the technology itself. Through this concept, we begin to understand the influence new mediums have on old or traditional ones, such as print and reading aloud to audiobooks. Throughout this recording, I will cover the who, what, where, when, why, and how of audiobooks. You, the listener, will hopefully come out of this with a well-developed understanding of the influence print culture has had on audiobooks and vice versa. Before I dive in, I would like to thank our main source, Matthew Rubery, that provided most of the historical information from his article, Audiobooks, Literature, and Sound Studies, published in 2011. Audiobooks. What are audiobooks? Definition. To start us off, I would like to explain to those of you who do not know what audiobooks are. An audiobook is a recording of a book read out loud. Seems simple enough, right? Multiple sources have stated that a phenomenology associated with audiobooks could be classified as reading with our ears. Now that may seem like a counterintuitive explanation, but bear with me, as I will explain the history and influence of audiobooks in hopes that by the end you will understand what reading with your ears means. Where can you find audiobooks? Nowadays, you can find audiobooks as easily as you can find music. With a simple internet search, you will be directed to thousands of online platforms that offer a wide variety of audiobook recordings. There are platforms that specialize in audiobooks such as Audible, and others that offer audiobooks along with their music streaming services like Spotify. It is less common to find audiobooks in other mediums such as CDs, cassette tapes, and records. But that is mainly because they are now outdated mediums, and audiobooks had to find a way to keep up with the times. But just as I had mentioned, audiobooks came in other mediums before digitalization. Where do audiobooks come from, and when were they made? Audiobooks in their earliest form originated alongside Thomas Edison's invention of the phonograph in 1877, but at this time it was not really an audiobook. See, this was just the beginning of the recording of the human voice with the invention of the phonograph. Although a vital part was the beginning of audio recording, audiobooks can be loosely traced back even earlier in human history. One could possibly consider the function of oral storytelling to be a form of an audiobook, minus the recording part. If we were to trace books back with this perspective, their existence would date back to as early as language was established. See, humans communicate for a purpose, and one of those purposes is storytelling. If we consider the term audiobooks as an oral story, tracking down its origination would be near impossible. If we decide to tighten up on what variables make audiobooks an audiobook, that takes us to a different point in history. By adding the variable that an audiobook must be read from a source and not just memory, we then start its existence with the birth of the written word. Again, this timeline is highly debated amongst scholars because they too find difficulty in the variables of what constituted as the written word. The written word then moved into the printed word, and if my memory serves me right, that had a huge impact on oral storytelling from recitation. Between literacy and accessibility to the written word and printed word, many people depended on others to read a book aloud, acting out a form of audiobooks. This was not only done as a service to others, but also became a norm in how people passed the time back in the old days. We passed just oral storytelling and oral storytelling from recitation, either written or print. If we tighten up these variables again, we are met with the restraint of recordings. Now we have to consider what makes an audiobook different from reading aloud from a source, and that would be listening to the reading from a new audio source. Now we are caught up a bit. Back to Thomas Edison, the phonograph, and audio recording of the human voice. There was one of many issues with the relation between Edison's invention and our term audiobooks, and that it wasn't really an audiobook, especially in the way we have known them for the past 100 years. Edison's talking machine required technical improvements in order to make recordings of literature a viable option. Limited to storage capacity of 4 minutes each, phonograph cylinders best suited brief spoken recordings excerpted from longer works. Yes, this means audio was recorded from books, but it was not the whole book, just bits and pieces. As time progressed and storage for recordings grew, the audiobook as we know it got closer. In the 1930s, the development of the slow-speed, close-grooved record capable of playing for at least 20 minutes made it possible to record longer narratives. Now that's a big leap in time, from 1877 to the 1930s, but that may just be from my modern perspective of how quickly technology changes compared to the actual birth of it. To move further into the when and where of audiobooks, we have to address the who and why, as in who were audiobooks originally made for and why. Who was the intended audience of audiobooks and why? According to Edison, in both The Phonograph and Its Future and The Perfected Phonograph, phonographic books were among the original applications for his new talking machine, which would speak to blind people without effort on their part. In short, the idea of audiobooks was a way for the visually impaired to enjoy literature without needing another person present to read it to them. The first recordings of an unabridged novels were made in Britain and the United States in the 1930s. The need for recorded literature in both countries arose in response to soldiers returning from the First World War with eye injuries and to others with vision impairments who were unable to read Braille. The recordings of books began in America as a part of the American Foundation for the Blind and the Library Congress Books for the Adult Blind Project. Audiobooks were initially intended for accessibility purposes for the visually impaired, but they soon took a drastic turn when audio publishing went mainstream. An old NPR clip explains that Caedmon Records was the first company dedicated to selling spoken word recordings to the public. Caedmon started in 1952, which soon launched the industry closer to what we know it today. As many of us have come to know, the introduction of a new medium often solves problems of the previous medium, such as reading aloud compared to recorded readings, making literature more accessible for the visually impaired. Recording mediums for all forms of audio technologically advanced rapidly. Audio recordings of the spoken word followed along each step of the way. This meant if a new medium was introduced for something like music, audiobooks were not far behind from joining the trend. From records to cassettes to CDs and now digitalization, audiobooks can be found during each pivotal moment in the history of technology. Back to our definition. A new variable I have purposely failed to mention for the complexity's sake of this assignment is the different names for audiobooks throughout time. The term we have associated with the recordings of a book was not established until 1994 when the Audio Publishers Association decided it as the industry standard. How have audiobooks influenced print culture? First, I will run over how they were influenced by print culture. It may seem obvious, but they are largely influenced by print culture, wherein the stories being read and recorded are usually a byproduct of the printed word. As I have previously explained, the printed word needed to be adapted to become accessible for the visually impaired. First came Braille, which is in need of an assignment on its own to explain, around 1829, although it has its own defined variables in when it truly began. Then came audio recording through the phonograph thanks to Thomas Edison. This shift in mediums revolutionized print culture by making it accessible to those who couldn't previously engage with it in the same way others could and still do. This just goes to show how print culture needed to expand and therefore influence the shift to audiobooks over time. But audiobooks as we know them today are not solely for the visually impaired. They have become accessible to people all around the world in almost every language, covering every subject and genre, and in different mediums of digitalization. I am now going to attempt to predict how they will influence the future of print culture. We can try to predict the future influence audiobooks will have on print culture by examining their history, which, if you were paying close attention to what I have droned on for the past while here, you may have your own predictions as well. In my opinion, I believe audiobooks will continue to evolve. We have moved from the need for a speaker present reading aloud to conducting oral storytelling to the recorded voice, which has prevailed since its origination. With the rapid growth rate within the AI industry, I believe this is to be the next shift with audiobooks. It has already begun, but there seem to be some issues with replicating the tone, pace, and overall fluidity of the human voice. But as scary as AI is, I think it will soon reach a point where it becomes indistinguishable from the human voice, minus the metadata behind the file. Additionally, I believe the future of audiobooks will continue on a similar stream as it has in the past 40 to 50 years. In this stream, audiobooks are no longer only a means for accessibility, but also a source of entertainment and knowledge. People are always on their phones, plugged in constantly, and often desire new content to fill their spatial audio. Sometimes music is what people want, but with podcasts' current rise in popularity, I assume audiobooks are not far behind if they aren't there already. Conclusion. All in all, I find it difficult to imagine a world without print culture influencing something, if not everything, in our daily lives. It may be difficult because people often see print culture defined by the variables of being a physically printed object, but if you loosen those variables just a smidge, endless variations of the printed word emerge. Need I say, for example, audiobooks come from books, so they still are books, in the context that they are the words inside of a book just being read out loud. As I mentioned in the beginning, I hoped by the end of this you would understand to some degree what reading with our ears meant, and now I send you off with this new knowledge and hope that you agree when I finish off by stating that audiobooks are books.